Calaroga Shark Media. Hello and welcome to Murder Weekly. This episode is titled Redemption.
The bullpen was quiet. The only sound, the rustling of papers and the occasional ring of a phone. Detective Jack "Sip" Malloy sat at his desk, his head in his hands, the weight of unsolved cases bearing down on him like a ton of bricks. Well, if it ain't the great Detective Malloy, a voice drawled from across the room. Sip looked up to see Detective Meldrick leaning against the doorframe, a smirk on his face. "Not now, Meldrick," Sip growled, his patience wearing thin. Meldrick sauntered over to Sip's desk, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "What's the matter, Sip? Another day, another murder you can't solve? The great detective, always on the hunt, never catching the prey." Sip's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with anger. "You got something to say, Meldrick? Or are you just here to bust my chops?" Meldrick held up his hands in mock surrender. "Hey man, I'm just calling it like I see it. You're like a dog chasing its tail, always running in circles, never getting anywhere." Just as Sip opened his mouth to fire back, the phone on his desk rang. He snatched it up, his voice clipped and professional. "Malloy, homicide." He listened intently, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, I got it. Be there in 10. He slammed the phone down, his eyes meeting Meldrick's. "Duty calls. Try not to solve all the cases while I'm gone." The crime scene was a dingy alleyway in the heart of the city. The body of a young man lying face down in a pool of his own blood. Sip crouched down, his eyes scanning the scene with a practiced eye. "What do we got?" he asked the uniformed officer standing nearby. "Victim's name is John Doe for now. No ID, no wallet. Looks like he took a brick to the head. Blunt force trauma, probably died instantly." Sip nodded, his mind already racing. "Any witnesses, suspects?" The officer shook his head. "Nah, this alley's a ghost town at night. But we did find something interesting." He held up a clear plastic bag, a small silver key glinting inside. Sip's eyes narrowed. "A key? To what?" "No idea. But it was lying right next to the body. Figured it might be important." Back at the precinct, Sip and his team pored over the evidence, trying to piece together the puzzle of John Doe's murder. The key, as it turned out, belonged to a storage unit on the outskirts of the city. When they opened the unit, they found a treasure trove of stolen goods, electronics, jewelry, even a few guns, and on the wall, a list of names and addresses, each one crossed out with a thick black line. "Looks like our John Doe was a thief," Sip mused, his eyes scanning the list. "And not a very good one if this is any indication." As they dug deeper, a picture began to emerge. John Doe, whose real name was Michael Simmons, had been stealing from some of the city's most notorious criminals. Drug dealers, gun runners, even a few corrupt cops. And one of those criminals, a vicious enforcer named Tony the Hammer Rossi, had a reputation for using bricks to teach his enemies a lesson. Sip checked his gun, the weight of it familiar and reassuring in his hand. "You ready for this?" he asked a young officer, his eyes scanning the building for any sign of trouble. The cop nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Let's nail this bastard." They approached the shop, the smell of grease and metal heavy in the air. A mechanic looked up from under the hood of a car, his eyes widening at the sight of their badges. "We're looking for Tony Rossi," Sip said, his voice calm but authoritative. The mechanic hesitated, his eyes darting towards the back of the shop. He's in his office, but he don't like to be disturbed." Sip smiled, a cold, humorless thing. "I'm sure he'll make an exception for us." They made their way to the back, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. Tony's office was a small, cluttered space, the walls lined with auto parts and racing memorabilia. And there, sitting behind a desk piled high with paperwork, was Tony Rossi himself. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What the hell do you want?" he growled, his hand inching towards a drawer in his desk. Sip's gun was out in a flash, leveled at Tony's chest. Keep your hands where I can see them. Tony's face twisted with rage, his fists clenching on the desk. You got nothing on me, cop. I'm a legitimate businessman. Tell that to Michael Simmons. For a moment, Tony looked like he might fight, his muscles tensing beneath his grease-stained shirt. But then, with a sigh of resignation, he stood up, his hands raised in surrender. The interrogation room was cold and bare, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on Tony Rossi's angular face. Sip leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. We know you killed Michael Simmons, Tony. We found your DNA on the brick and your fingerprints all over that storage unit. It's over. Tony laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You got nothing, detective. I ain't saying a word without my lawyer. But Sip was undeterred. See, that's where you're wrong, Tony. We've got a witness, someone who saw you in that alley, saw you bash Michael's head in with that brick, and they're willing to testify. It was a bluff, a last-ditch effort to get Tony to crack, but to Sip's surprise, it worked. Tony's face drained of color, his eyes wide with fear. All right, I did it, he stammered, his voice shaking. But you gotta understand, Michael was stealing from me, from my boss. I had no choice. Back at the precinct, Sip stood in front of the whiteboard, his eyes fixed on Michael Simmons' name. With a heavy sigh, he picked up an eraser and began to wipe the name away, the red ink disappearing like a bad dream. Another case closed, Meldrick said from behind him, his voice uncharacteristically somber. Sip nodded, his eyes still on the board. Simmons wasn't a saint, but he didn't deserve to die like that. Meldrick clapped a hand on Sip's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. You can't save everyone, Sip, but you got justice for Michael, and that's something. Sip turned to face his colleague, a wry smile tugging at his lips. I thought you said I was a dog chasing my tail, never getting anywhere. Meldrick grinned, his eyes twinkling with mirth. Even a broken clock is right twice a day, Sip. Even a broken clock.
Murder Weekly is a Calaroga Shark media production, written and hosted by Aidan I. Flanagan, produced by Mark Francis, executive producers, Mark Francis and John McDermott. Portions of this podcast may have been created with the assistance of AI. Calaroga Shark Media.